Wel, bore da, or noswaith dda. Good morning, good evening, wherever you're watching in the world. My name's Amanda Whitehead, and I run the Welsh Lady Walking Tours in Conwy. And today I've joined the 21st century, and I'm going to take you on a little walk and talk through an iconic site in Conwy. And no, it is not the castle. So bear with me while I share my screen and we'll go for a little stroll learning about this iconic town. All towns are a product of their geography and their history, and Conwy is no different. We're squashed between the mountains of Snowdonia to the south, the Irish Sea to the north, the English flatlands to our east, and the road to Ireland running west. And between it all is the estuary of the River Conwy, which is very important because we're not a seaside town like Llandudno or a riverside town like Betws-y-Coed. We are very much dependent on the ebbs and flows of the tides of our estuary. And they've always caused problems. Right back for centuries when people were crossing to Ireland, they had to run the sandbanks and the storm surges from rain in the Snowdonia Mountains coming down and neap and tides rushing in. And there were a lot of shipwrecks and disasters in the crossing of the Conwy. Now in Conwy, St. Mary's Churchyard lies a grave to a blacksmith from Holyhead, who was sadly drowned on Christmas Day, 1806. And not just him, 26 other passengers lost their lives in a storm that night. Something had to be done. So Parliament debated it. And this was also the time when Britain got Ireland and the Irish MPs had to be got to Westminster. So Parliament ordered the first new road to be built in Britain since the Romans. We call it the A5 now, starting in London and going to Holyhead. And they appointed a famous Scottish engineer, Thomas Telford, to oversee this structure. And part of his project was he had to devise a way to cross the Conwy. And there are our three bridges now, but none of them existed until Telford's time, and he was responsible for the first one in the middle. The first thing he had to do, of course, was bridge as much of the river as he could with a causeway. So he dumped lots of masonry in the river, and we still use that causeway today. If you come into Conwy now to the three bridges, you'll drive along the road, which has now been diverted to cover the 1950s road bridge rather than Telford's original suspension bridge. But I'm not going to deprive you of the treat of walking across it, which is what we're going to do now. The bridge is now looked after by the National Trust. And as we go past one of Telford's famous sunburst toll gates, where we would have had to stop 150 years ago to pay our fee for crossing the bridge, we'll walk first past the cables that hold up from towers. The deck of the bridge is held up. Now, they'd had footbridges suspended before, but no one had ever made a bridge strong enough to take a coach and 8 horses across. But not only was Telford thinking of the engineering, he didn't want to detract from the very famous, even in those days, castle of Edward I, dating back to the 1280s. So he built his towers, which you can see the chains going up to there, to blend in with the castle with castellated tops. And we're very lucky to be able to walk over it today. For social distancing and COVID, the National Trusts are allowing us to cross it. But Telford wasn't the only Scottish engineer involved with bridging the Conwy. The other engineer was Robert Stephenson, son of the Rocket Man. No, not Elton John, George Stephenson, who built the famous steam engine. Now, you can't put a railway locomotive on a suspension bridge. It would just swing around too much. So he tested different shaped tubes, suspending whole locomotives in warehouses from oval tubes, and he settled on a wrought iron box girder construction. And the London to Holyhead Railway still goes through the original wrought iron work. But Telford's bridge was becoming a problem. By the 1950s, it was so snarled up, it was only designed for a horse and cart, and all the holiday traffic pouring into North Wales was coming over the bridge. So in the 1950s, they decided to build another bridge, and that's the one we use to get into the town today. But then, of course, nothing changes. By the 1980s, we were all snarled up again. The medieval wall town was chock-a-block with traffic. But they didn't want to spoil that wonderful view of the estuary. Can you imagine a concrete motorway monstrosity over that? The answer was going to be a tunnel. But you can't tunnel into sand. It's into an estuary. So the answer was, again, innovative engineering. They came up with the idea of Europe's first immersed tube tunnel. They hollowed out a basin in the sand dunes that's now our marina, and they cast 6 enormous concrete tubes, floated them out to the middle of the estuary and bolted them together and sunk them in a trench. And if you pass underneath Conwy today, that is what you will be travelling through. And it was opened by Her Majesty the Queen in 1992. So I do hope you've enjoyed our little stroll over the crossings of Conwy. And I do hope to see you back again for some more virtual tours. Thank you for coming with me.